Is Bible exist in original form?
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. So, as Bob was pointing out, I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which, as you all know, is in it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, which creates certain interesting moments in teaching historical approaches toward early Christianity and the New Testament. This last year, I was teaching my course on the New Testament. So I had a class of about 360 students in it. And I decided to do something this last year that I had never done before. I began my class by asking students the following question. I said, how many of you in here would agree with the proposition that the Bible is the inspired Word of God? Boom! The entire room raises its hand. All right, good, great. Now, how many of you have read the Da Vinci Code, I asked? Boom! The entire room raises its hand. Oh, good, okay. Now, how many of you have read the entire Bible? Scattered hands. I said, all right. Now, I'm not telling you that I think God wrote the Bible. You're telling me that you think God wrote the Bible. I can see why you might want to read a book by Dan Brown. I mean, if God wrote a book, wouldn't you want to see what he had to say? It's just one of the mysteries of living in the South. Well, the Bible is the most widely purchased, most thoroughly revered, and probably most broadly misunderstood book in the history of human civilization. One of the things that's misunderstood, at least by my 19-year-old students at Chapel Hill, is that when we're reading the Bible, we're not actually reading the words of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We're reading translations from the Greek language in which these books were written. And something is always lost in translation. And not only that, but we're not reading translations of the originals of these books, because we don't have the originals of these books or of any of the other books of the New Testament. What we have are copies made centuries later, many of them many centuries later. These thousands of copies that we have are all different from one another in lots of little ways and sometimes in big ways. There are places where we don't know what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote. Now, for some Christians, that's not a problem because they don't have a high view of Scripture. For others, it's a very big problem. What does it mean to say that God inspired the words of the text if we don't have the words? Moreover, why should one think that God performed the miracle of inspiring the words of the Bible if he didn't perform the miracle of preserving the words of the Bible? If he meant to give us his very words, why didn't he make sure we received them? The problem of not having the originals of the New Testament, though, is a problem for everyone, not simply for those who believe that the Bible was inspired by God. For all of us, I think, the Bible is the most important book in the history of Western civilization. It continues to be cited in public debates over gay rights, abortion, over whether to go to war with foreign countries, over how to organize and run our society. But how do we interpret the New Testament? It's hard to know what the words of the New Testament mean if we don't know what the words were. And so in this lecture, I'll be talking about not knowing what the words were and what we might know about the originals of the New Testament, how they got lost, and how possibly they might be reconstructed. So let me begin by talking about, on a fairly basic level, how it is that we got the books of the New Testament. The books of the New Testament were all written in Greek. They were all written in the first century of the Common Era. They were written by Greek-speaking Christians who wanted to share with their community their views of Jesus, of the faith, of what to believe and how to behave. So an author like Mark, the author of our first gospel, sat down and wrote out one day his gospel about Jesus, the circulation. The problem is we're dealing with an age in which there were no Xerox machines. There wasn't desktop publishing yet, no PDF files. In fact, there wasn't carbon paper. How did people get copies of books? Well, in the ancient world, the only way to get a copy of a book was to copy it by hand. One page, one sentence, one word, one letter at a time. Mark makes his book, and somebody in his community wants another copy of it. And so that person either makes a copy himself or has somebody else make a copy for him. Now, part of the problem is that in the ancient world, at this time period in the Roman Empire, probably something like 90% of the population was illiterate, couldn't read or write. So not anybody could just make a copy. And most people who could write couldn't write very well. And so somebody makes a copy. We don't know who it was who made the first copy. We don't know if this person was competent or incompetent, but he made a copy. And probably, if he made a copy of this book by hand, one page, one sentence, one word, one letter at a time, he made mistakes. Now, my students sometimes have difficulty believing that people make mistakes when they copy things by hand. And so I tell them, well, you sit down tonight and copy the Gospel of Mark and see how you do. Well, in fact, they'll make mistakes. Now, here we have a problem year after year. We don't have a copy of Mark until around the year 200, about 150 years after Mark was originally written. So not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies, or the copies of the copies, or the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies, etc., etc. Mistakes were made en route, and these mistakes were replicated. Now, the only way a mistake gets corrected is if you're copying a copy of Mark, and you come across a sentence that you're pretty sure is wrong because it doesn't make sense, and you try and correct it. And so you correct it to say something other than what it says. The problem is there's no guarantee that you will correct the mistake correctly, right? You might correct the mistake incorrectly, in which case you've got three forms of the text: the original text, the mistake, and the mistaken correction of the mistake. And so it goes on. For year after year, decade after decade, the originals end up getting lost. They get lost. They're either worn out of existence, or people figure, well, we don't need this. I've got a brand new copy of it, and so they throw it away. And all of the books of the New Testament, all 27 books, experience the same fate. And so that is the situation we're dealing with. Probably the most egregious mistake in any manuscript of the New Testament, one of my favorites, is in a manuscript that's manuscript 109. It's 109 because it's written on parchment and animal skin instead of papyrus, and it's the 109th manuscript that was cataloged. This is a 10th century manuscript that was written by a scribe who wasn't paying attention, and this scribe was copying the Gospel of Luke. Now, the Gospel of Luke is one of the two Gospels in the New Testament that has a genealogy of Jesus. Genealogies usually aren't the favorite reading of my students at Chapel Hill. And I think probably it wasn't the favorite reading of this guy because he wasn't really paying attention to what he was doing. But, in Luke's genealogy is actually fairly interesting because in Matthew's the other gospel that gives a genealogy of Jesus, and it traces Jesus' line all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews, in Matthew. Luke doesn't stop there. Luke keeps going. Luke traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam, as in Adam and Eve. This is a fantastic genealogy. I've got an aunt who's a genealogist who's traced my family, back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower, Adam and Eve. So it's, Jesus is supposedly the son of Joseph, who's the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, who's the son of David, son of Jesse, son of so-and-so. It goes all the way back. Isaac, son of Abraham, so back to, Seth, son of Adam, who's the son of God. Okay, this genealogy goes all the way back. So the scribe of manuscript 109 is copying a manuscript that evidently gave the genealogy in two columns. But the second column didn't go to the bottom of the page. It only went partway down, the second column. So the first column, second column, partway down. And the scribe apparently didn't realize that this genealogy was in two columns. And so he copied across the columns. instead of copying one column, then the other column, leading to some very interesting results. As it turns out, Adam isn't the first human being. There was a man named Phares, who's the father of the human race. And as it turns out, God is the son of Aram. So it happens. These kinds of mistakes are just pure accidental mistakes that scribes mess up in places. There are other kinds of mistakes that are what I think are probably intentional mistakes. I differentiate between accidental mistakes where scribes just slip up and intentional mistakes where it looks like scribes are actually trying to change the text. Now, I don't know for sure that scribes are trying to change the text. I don't have any scribes around to interrogate about the matter. But there are some changes that don't look like they could possibly simply be a slip of the pen. And there are others that are debatable, whether they were a slip of the pen or not. But let me give you a couple of examples, and you'll see that some of these look like scribes maybe wanted to change the text. I'll give you a couple for instances. Is in one of Jesus' discourses in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 24, in which Jesus is talking about what's going to happen at the end of time. This passage actually was very important. I feel a tangent coming on here, by the way. This passage was very important when I moved to Chapel Hill in 1988. Bob, you had been gone for a year at this time. In 1988, there was a big furor in North Carolina. There were Christian groups who thought that the end of the world was going to happen in 1988. That Jesus was going to come back and take everybody out of the world who were his followers. That's the rapture, right? When the rapture, and Jesus comes back, takes people out of the world, and then all hell breaks out on earth for 7 years, and then the end comes, right? So there was a guy who had written a book based on this passage I'm going to talk about in a second. A guy had written this book that was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. This book was in 2 million copies. I had students whose parents believed it and literally sold the farm. They thought that Jesus was going to come back in 1988. And so I just showed up in North Carolina kind of blissfully ignorant of these things. And I moved from New Jersey where such things we're not worried about. And but this guy named Edgar Whisenant, he was a NASA engineer who had studied the Bible and come up with 88 reasons why the rapture is going to occur in 1988. And one of the reasons involves this passage I'm going to talk about. Jesus tells the disciples want to know, when's the end going to come? And Jesus tells them, learn the parable of the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, when these things take place, you know that the end is near. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. So Edgar Whisenant, this is one of Edgar Whisenant's 88 reasons. So the way it works is this. What is Israel in the Bible? Israel is sometimes represented as a fig tree. Well, when the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that the end is near. Well, okay, so if the fig tree is Israel, when does the fig tree put forth its leaves? Well, the fig tree lies dormant over the winter, and then when springtime comes, it comes back to life. When does Israel come back to life? 1948. That's when Israel comes back to life, becomes a nation again. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo, 1988. This was one of the 88 reasons. Now, somebody pointed out to Edgar Whisenant that Jesus in the same passage points out that no one knows the day or the hour when the end will come. When Whisenant had said that it was going to come during the week of Rosh Hashanah in September. And so they said, but Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour. And Whisenant was completely unfazed. He said, I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week. All right, so this passage actually throughout Christian history has been important because people have always been trying to figure out when the end's going to come. So in this passage, Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour, not the angels of heaven, nor even the Son, but the Father alone. Okay, Matthew 24:36. Scribes copying that found it to be a peculiar thing to say, though. Not even the Son knows when the end is going to come? I mean, surely the Son of God is all-knowing. Isn't he omniscient? And so how do scribes deal with the problem? They deal with the problem by getting rid of the phrase. And so in later manuscripts, the phrase, not even the Son, is taken out, so that now Jesus doesn't claim to be ignorant about when the end is going to come. So that strikes me as probably an intentional sort of change. All right, so you get accidental changes and you get intentional changes.
Do we have the original manuscripts of New Testament? Let's hear from Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Ehrman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
The problem is not the number of manuscripts or the fact that we have more than for any other author of antiquity. The problem is the ages of these manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None. From the decades after the books were written, how many do we have? The years afterwards, the decade, none. 0. How many do we have from the early 2nd century? Say, manuscripts that clearly date up to around the year 150. We have 1 scrap. This is it. This may look big because it's a big screen. This is the actual size. It's the size of a credit card. It's written on both front and back. It's from John chapter 18. It has several verses on it. You can see this little scrap has parts of 7 lines on it. It's a very important manuscript because it's the earliest one we have. It's the early 2nd century, and it is the only manuscript we have from the early 2nd century. That's it. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? We're not just talking about decades now after these things were originally written and copied and mistakes made and mistakes replicated and then more mistakes made and more replicated. We're not talking about years or decades. We're talking about centuries. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? None. 0. Well, if we have 5,500 manuscripts, where are they from? When are they from? Well, 94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later. 94% come from the 9th century, which is great if you want to know what the Bible looked like when Christians were reading it in the year 890. But if you want to know how they were reading it in the year 70, you've got a problem, because you don't have manuscripts from that period. If you wanted to make a stack of the Bibles that are available to scholars today in manuscript form, the stack would go up to the ceiling. If you want to make a stack of the manuscripts that were made within, say, 60 or 80 years of the production of these books, you wouldn't be able to see the stack if we put it on the stage, because there's hardly anything. We do not have the originals of the New Testament, period. In order to understand what I mean by that, we have to realize how books were made in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when the Bible was produced, books could not be mass-produced. This was before electronic publication, Kinko's, or the printing press. Books were written by hand, and they were copied by hand. If you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to copy it for you, or you had to copy it yourself. You copied it 1 page, 1 sentence, 1 word at a time. What happens when somebody sits down to try to copy a book by hand? Invariably what happens is they make mistakes, either on purpose or accidentally. Scribes who copied texts in the ancient world changed their texts. Let me explain how it worked by giving an example from the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. We're not sure who Mark was, when he lived, where he lived. Whoever he was, he wrote a gospel. If anybody wanted a copy of this Gospel of Mark, they had to make a copy by hand, and so they did so. But invariably, they made a mistake or 2 or 3 or 20. When someone came along who wanted a copy of that copy, they copied the copy and they replicated the mistakes that the first copyist made. And they made their own mistakes. And then when a third person came along to copy the copy of the copy, they replicated the mistakes of both of their predecessors and made mistakes of their own. And it went on like this, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The only time mistakes got corrected in the process was when somebody was copying something and realized that there was a mistake and thought that his predecessor had made a mistake and so tried to correct the mistake. The problem is there's no telling whether a person who corrected the mistake corrected it correctly. It's possible that he corrected the mistake incorrectly, in which case you have 3 forms of the text: the original text, the text that was changed, and the incorrect correction of the change. Things like that go on for a very long time. We don't have the original copy that Mark made. We don't have the first copy. We don't have copies of the copy. We don't have copies of the 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 copies. The earliest copy that we have of Mark dates from around the year 200, probably about 130 years after the original. That's the first copy that we have, 130 years after the original. We don't have the originals of Mark or of any other book of the New Testament.
If God preserved the original text intact, where is it? Why don't we have it, and why doesn't He know where it is? I don't know the answer to that.
If the question means, are the original New Testament documents lost, then yes, of course they are. Only quacks and charlatans, people who got their diplomas from a Cracker Jack box, would argue otherwise.
Coming to the New Testament. Coming to the New Testament. In the King James Version. In some modern translations, they have omitted these words, which I'm going to say now. But in the King James Version, which Brother Swaggart uses, so he advertises this book here, King James Version. And in the King James Version, the New Testament starts. The first book is the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Second book, the Gospel according to St. Mark. Third book, the Gospel according to St. Luke. Fourth book, the Gospel according to St. John. I'm asking, what is this according to? According to, according to. Why according to? You see, you don't get the joke. You just read the Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. I said, what is this according? Why according to? This little publication, it says there, Ahmad Deedat. That's my book. I wrote it. I'm responsible. You can take me to task. If I have made some utterances here which are false, you can take me to task, because this is my book. But if it was according to Ahmad Deedat, that means somebody else wrote it, not me. You are telling that according, maybe it was not according to what I'm thinking, but you're attributing things to me. It could be a lie against me, but if I wrote it, I'm responsible. But if somebody attributes something to me, say, according to Mr. Deedat, it could be false. So every book begins according to, because Matthew didn't sign his name, Mark didn't sign his name, Luke didn't sign his name, John didn't sign his name. These are anonymous books somebody had written. And they just say, well, I think this Matthew could have. I think this is the work of Mark. I think, it seems to fit Luke's mentality. I think only John could have spoken like that. So according. The internal evidence also shows, like for example, that Matthew didn't write Matthew. Matthew, chapter 9, verse 9. It says, while he, that is Jesus, was going forth into the way, he, Jesus, saw a tax collector called Matthew And he, Jesus, came up to him, Matthew, and said unto him, Matthew, follow me, Jesus. And he, Matthew, followed him, Jesus. I'm asking, did Jesus write that? Did Matthew write that? If Matthew wrote it, he said, while he was going forth into the way, he saw me collecting taxes at the tax collector's table. And he came up to me and said unto me, follow me, and I followed him. That's Matthew talking. But this is somebody writing in the third person. See, not the words of Jesus, not the words of Matthew. And one of the leading lights of the Christian world, J.B. Phillips, an Anglican, a prebendary of the Chichester Cathedral in England, he translated the Gospels, the New Testament, into modern English. See, most of this English here is archaic, old-fashioned. Thee and thou and thine. So he brought it down to this ordinary, usual level, colloquial level. The Gospels into modern English. And in his preface to the Gospel, he says, early tradition ascribed this Gospel to the Apostle Matthew. That's what people said, that Matthew wrote the book. But scholars nowadays almost all reject the view. Who scholars? Muslim scholars? Jewish scholars? Hindu scholars? No. Christian scholars. Christian scholars of the highest eminence. They say that Matthew didn't write Matthew. Say the author, whom we may still conveniently call Matthew. Conveniently. Because instead of saying the first book of the New Testament, chapter 9, verse 9, the first book of the New Testament, chapter 5, verse 17, wasting my breath, wasting time in writing, wasting space, ink. He says, no. So I said Matthew 9, 9. I said Matthew 5, 17. Conveniently, I'm using the name, the term. He said the author, whom we may still conveniently call Matthew, has plainly drawn on the mysterious Q. Now this Q is in inverted commas. It stands for the German word Quelle, means sources, some mysterious sources, which might have been a collection of oral traditions. He has used Mark's gospel freely. This man, who's supposed to be Matthew, has used Mark's gospel freely. In the language of the school teacher, he has been copying wholesale from Mark. In the language of the school teacher, he's copying wholesale from Mark. And Mark was a 10-year-old boy when Jesus walked this earth. Can you imagine an eyewitness, a ear witness, a companion of Jesus? He goes and copies a 10-year-old boy who wasn't there. Does it make sense to you? If it was Matthew, would he go and copy somebody else? And a child of 10? So therefore we know, not only that it is not the word of God, but it is not even the words of Matthew.
When I was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, attending Moody Bible Institute, before I began my serious scholarship on the New Testament, before I began to read it in Greek, and before I saw what serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was absolutely convinced that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, but that they were written by two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by two people who were close companions to people who were eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things. But I don't want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this. God gave you a brain to think with. Apply reason. That's why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous, and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody. Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter because the Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
A huge part of understanding why the Quran is a miracle is understanding how it was revealed. The Quran came down over 23 years in spoken form. It was not written down. Once verses came down, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, recited them, and his companions memorized them. Unlike any other book, the Quran did not go through an editing process. Once the verse was spoken, it was done. That was the final version. The verses were not revealed in order, starting from chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 3, and so on. The chapters and verses were revealed out of sequence. Furthermore, they could not be planned ahead of time. They were revealed as a result of life experiences that were out of the Prophet's control, such as enemies challenging him or the believers asking him life questions. To summarize, the Quran has been perfectly preserved and unchanged for 14 centuries whilst excelling linguistically, scientifically, historically, and mathematically. It has a profound impact on those who listen to it and is memorized and recited by hundreds of millions of people worldwide.
اصبح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كم من فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة فإذا وعى القرآن حين لانا كم من فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة فإذا وعى القرآن حين لانا فإذا وعى القرآن حين لانا اقرأ أخيها ورتل القرآن اسمح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان